This video is going to be about how to study poetic books of the Bible. When we read books on how to study the Bible, or we listen to teachings on how to study the Bible, we hear about needing to study a book of the Bible according to the genre it's written in, whether it's narrative, whether it's prophecy or poetry. But what we don't always do as authors or teachers is tell people then what that difference is. And so what we're going to look at in this video is the idea of poetic devices and how they aid and how to properly understand them in order to study the scriptures. Now, we're not going to be able to look at every poetic device that's used. We're only going to look at the Old Testament side of things and how Hebrew poetry worked. Like I said, I can't get to them all, but we'll look at a basic amount of them and get the general idea at least of how these poetic devices help us understand where the line of thought is of the author, and then what each one of those individual ones are that we can touch on, how they work together in the interpretation process. Now, what I'm going to do, because Psalms and Proverbs are very easy to understand that they're poetic, is I'm going to pull all my examples from the book of Amos to show that not only is Psalms and Proverbs poetic, but a lot of times our prophets use poetic devices as well. So when we're studying through the prophets, we got to have our eyes out of these poetic devices to see maybe this passage needs to be interpreted a little bit different than what we've been doing thus far in the book of prophecy because of the poetic nature of it. First, we need to look at the basic layout of a poem in Hebrew poetry. So a poem is your big encompass thing of thought. It's your main unit. And let's look at these references and the idea of a home. All right. If we're looking at it as an analogy of a home, the poem is the home itself. Then from there, the poem is broken up into stanzas. And what a stanza is a stanza would be like the individual rooms within a house. The stanza then is broken up into strophes. And a strophe would be like the furniture that are inside that room. And each strophe is broken up into a different amount of colon, whether it's a bicolon, speaking of 2, or a tricolon of 3, and on and on and on things. So that colon would be like the parts that make up the furniture. So a stanza that's likened to a room in a house are sections of complete thought. Now, we can't forget that, because that means stanzas cannot be broken up. Otherwise, the author or the interpreter is not going to get the full idea. To break up a stanza is to break up a complete thought of the author, or another way to put that, of what we've talked about in the hermeneutical videos, is that pericope of thought, that complete thought that's trying to get across. So we're going to break up some stanzas in the idea of how they're going to help interpret each other, but don't get confused in that, thinking that we can totally understand a passage by pulling it out of the stanza as a whole, because the stanzas are complete thoughts, and we got to remember that when we look at that as poetry. Okay, they're tied together, and they can't be pulled in individual parts to totally understand them. Stanzas are to be interpreted as a unit then, along with how that unit fits in the poem as a whole. All right, so we can't forget that as well. Not only is the stanza complete thought, but it's a complete thought within a poem in and of itself. So the text I'm going to use is Amos chapter 5, and we're going to look at the whole chapter and look at the poetic devices that Amos uses within that chapter to break up his different stanzas and strophes. So let's start with the stanzas. All right, the stanzas being that complete unit of thought, the rooms within a house, as the analogy would say. We can see he uses a chiasmic pattern, or some people will call it an inversion, because there's one part that stands alone. As you'll notice on the left, I have bright red letters of A, B, C, D, and then it starts repeating backwards, C, B, A. That's showing the chiasmic pattern. The letters that correspond to each other are parallel, meaning they're saying the same thing. So verses 1 through 2 kind of stand by themselves. They're kind of an introduction and kind of a monocolon. Both 1 and 2 are separate monocolons. But verse 3 talks about a lamentation, and so does verses 16 through 17 at the bottom, lamentation. Verses 4 through 6 are exhortation, and verses 14 through 15 are an exhortation. And you can see that pattern as we move in, where verses 8 and 9 stand in the center of the chiasmic pattern, or what some people would call an inversion, and that's the hymn. Now, a lot of times, the reason that they use the word inversion is when you have that one that's like D here that doesn't have a parallel passage to it, or what we would show as a parallel alphabetical letter to it. is saying, because that stands alone, some people will call that an inversion. Otherwise, people would just call a chiasmic pattern when everything has a parallel to it. Other people just include everything as a chiasmic pattern. But when there is one that stands alone, what some would call an inversion pattern, that's usually the focus of that stanza, or sometimes this is used for strophes as well. But in this case, since we're looking at a stanza, the emphasis is on verses 8 through 9. Now again, this is a complete thought, so we don't disregard everything else, but it's bringing us to a main issue there in verses 8 and 9. All right, so let's go back though to the structure, what we're looking at. This stanza, we see by this chiasmic pattern, shows us the boundaries of this stanza, this complete thought. Verses 3 through 17 form the first stanza in chapter 5. If we look at the next section of chapter 5 of Amos, we see that it's another chiasmic pattern. So verses 18 through 27 form another chiasmic pattern within chapter 5 itself. All right, so again, we can see the same thing what we just seen in the last slide. Verses 18 to 20 are parallel to verses 26 through 27. Verses 21 through 23 are parallel to verse 25. And verse 24 stands alone, again, showing emphasis on this stanza. So this slide, I'm just showing you then the breakdown of chapter 5 of Amos and showing how the first half is a chiasmic pattern and the second half is a chiasmic pattern. So this slide is just basically showing you what we've said thus far and how it looks as a whole. Now let's look at a strophe. A strophe is a subunit of a stanza. So if, again, we go back to the analogy of a house, the strophe is then the furniture within the house. All right, it's that subunit of a stanza. It assists in interpretation through its poetic devices, which we'll look at in a moment. They're seldom defined in the biblical texts themselves, but it's left up to the reader to define, and that's what we're going to try to help with some of these videos, is to better understand how to define these poetic devices. And then the colon within each strophe, again, the colon being like the pieces that make up the furniture, they can be used to compare each other, and we're going to see how that works as we get into the different strophes. We're not necessarily going to get deep into the colon themselves, but we're going to see how they work together in order to determine the meaning of the strophe that they're defining. All right, so let's get into the meat of the study. So we're in the strophe section. Now, let me take a step back, though, for a second, and to realize that even though Amos's stanzas are set up in chiasmic pattern, that's not always how every stanza is going to be set up in poetic devices. Some of these poetic devices of the synonymous parallelism, TERRACE effect, some of these other things we're going to look at, sometimes those are used to define the borders of a strophe or a stanza as well. So just what Amos uses here is not necessarily what every poetic device is going to use. So I want us to realize that stanzas are not only defined by chiasmic patterns, there's other patterns as well of what we're going to see going through here. So don't get thrown off by that. I'm just showing you from the text of Amos what some of these things look like in the context of a poem. All right. But so now we're looking at, in Amos is chapter 5 poem here. One of his strophes is set up in a synonymous parallelism, meaning the borders of the strophe are set up this way. And I have two of them up here on this slide, so don't get confused that this is one synonymous parallelism, but two separate ones, all right? And I broke up the colon into two sections, with obviously the colon separating them. So in the first example, you have the Virgin of Israel has fallen. She will rise no more. So the synonymous parallelism, means that this is saying the exact same thing twice. All right, the author's just using synonyms or words that mean the same thing to say the same thing twice. So the virgin is then repeated with the word she, and then has fallen is synonymous with the idea of rise no more. So where this comes into play in biblical interpretation then is we don't look at the Virgin of Israel has fallen and try to interpret that, and then look at she will rise no more and then add a different interpretation to that, saying what does the author mean by saying this part. But no, because this is defining the boundaries of a strophe, what it's telling us is this is one complete little statement here. The author is just repeating himself. So the virgin of Israel has fallen, she will rise no more, has one interpretation to it. That's all we need to focus on. We don't have to take each individual one of these pieces. He's just saying the same thing twice. And a lot of times why they would use synonymous parallelism or some of these other poetic devices that we're going to be looking at is because the scriptures were oral. And if we've ever sat there and listened to a teacher speak through the Bible, sometimes our minds will wander and we'll miss some of what the author has said. But then when he goes to interpret the text, if he repeats some of the stuff that he read, we catch it that second time. That's kind of the same idea with synonymous parallelism, of saying the same thing twice. If you missed it the first time, I'm going to say it again. Not only does it give emphasis as well, saying this is important, I'm repeating it twice, but it helps make sure you retain the information. It helps you, if you didn't quite understand it the first way, to get it the second way. And that's where we talked about how the second colon will help interpret the first colon. If you have no idea what the virgin falling means, well then maybe the idea of she will rise no more helps you better understand that. And then we have the second example at the bottom. She lies forsaken on her land. There's no one to raise her up. Again, the idea of being forsaken on her land and not being raised up are saying the exact same thing, just with synonyms. Let's look at the TERRACE pattern. This pattern is found in Amos, the 3rd verse of chapter 5. For thus says the Lord Yahweh, the city that goes out by 1,000 shall have 100 left, and that which goes out by 100 shall have 10 left to the house of Israel. What marks a terrace in poetic devices is the idea that the last half of one colon is repeated in the first half of the other. And here we see the idea of 100 being repeated twice. It's at the end of the first colon and it's at the beginning of the first one. And then there's linear motion to it. We have the idea of 1,000, then 100, and then 100 repeated, and then 10 being left. So it's like a staircase, and that's kind of why I set up the slide in this fashion, to kind of be able to visually see what's going on here. So it's showing a linear motion, and in this case it's showing a dwindling effect. And so the emphasis again is on the fact that there's a dwindling of the amount of people that are going to be left. Again, emphasis shouldn't be so much on the fact of each individual part of what this terrace device is saying, but on the complete unit as a whole. The idea that's being portrayed is the fact that things are dwindling, not necessarily the amounts they're spoken of. The borders of a strophe can also be defined by a chiasmic pattern, and here we have that from verses 10 through 13. They're also set up in a chiasmic pattern. Verses 10 is parallel to verse 13. The first part of verse 11 is parallel with the last part of verse 12. So we're looking at the strophe. So let's take a step back though and look at the stanza. The first stanza in chapter 5 is broken up in a chiasmic pattern. Then I have in a different color the representation of the alphabetical letter C, verses 10 through 13. Highlighted, showing the aspect of, that's the one we just talked about, that has a chiasmic pattern in of itself to mark the strophe boundaries. So I just wanted to show you here that there's a chiasmic pattern within another chiasmic pattern. Antithetic parallelism is the opposite of synonymous parallelism, so it's saying an opposite thing. All right, so the first example I have is from Amos chapter 5 verse 11. Though you have built houses of hewn stone, you should not dwell in them. All right, so they're building something, and the idea of building something is the idea that you or somebody else are going to dwell into it. But he's saying that's not going to happen. You will not dwell. So it's antithetical. It's the opposite. All right, and the second part is the same thing. It's another antithetic parallelism. You have planted pleasant vineyards. The idea there is somebody's going to eat of the fruit. But what does God say? But you shall not drink wine from them. All right, so it's antithetic because it's saying one thing, but what you're thinking is not going to happen. All right, so again, same as the synthetic parallelism, these are interpreted as a unit in themselves, not each individual part, but as a complete thought within themselves. Sound imagery is another poetic device. So we can see that even in the English here in verse 16, but we have the repetition of the word in English in all, and then alas, alas, or in Hebrew it would be bakal, bakal, and then you'd have at the end a ho, ho. So when you have a repetition of sound, obviously this can look different in different ways, but that's another way that's going to break up either a stanza or in this case a strophe. Here we have a motif phrase used in verses 18 through 20 to mark the boundaries of a strophe. And here we have the repetition of the phrase, the day of Yahweh. This is also incluso because it starts at the beginning of the strophe and it's at the end. So again, marking the border of the strophe, but also sandwiching in the information in between. Motif words aren't always just used twice. They can be something that's repeated over and over again within a strophe, or in some cases they're marking a stanza as well, and they're repeated multiple times within a stanza. But in this case, it's marking the boundaries of the strophe. A SORITES is another poetic device. This is a lot like the TERRACE effect, except for a phrase isn't repeated. This is found in verse 19. It will be as though a man fled from a lion and a bear met him, or as though he went into the house, leaned his hand on the wall, and a serpent bit him. So again, we have linear motion here, but in this case it's more logical than it is in the TERRACE effect. And again, it's giving the idea that no matter what they do, they can't get away from what God is going to cause to happen to them. All right, so just like we've seen in the parallelisms, again, this needs to be interpreted in its context of the SORITES itself, not each individual part. You don't want to just be looking at a man fleeing from a lion and trying to figure out exactly what that means, and then him going into the house with the leopard and what that means, the serpent. Now you can be doing that maybe with application, but interpretation, it's giving that idea of linear motion. Now again, depends on what you're trying to do on interpretation on this passage. You can be getting into kind of some of these aspects, but be very careful when you're doing that you're not going away from what the original intent was of the author in the interpretation aspect, because he's really just trying to show this linear motion that no matter what they try to do, it's not going to happen. So try to focus more on your applications on each one of these parts and keep your interpretation to the SORITES as a whole. Accents are the emphasis that we put on words. Now this breaks down in English because we're looking at the Hebrew text, and in Hebrew, verse 24 only has 6 words into it, and so that's how the accents works. With English, as you can see, we have multiple words here. So I broke it up with the dash in between, but figure like the first part, but let run down, that's one word in Hebrew, all right? And like water is another word in Hebrew. So because of the emphasis of the accent of a word, you got this repetition of 3, 3, 3. So I'm going to break it up in the sentences. We're not going to get the flow like you would in Hebrew, but to get an idea of the rhythm, we'll do it in Hebrew or in English this way. But let run down like water, justice, and righteousness like a stream, mighty. All right, almost like you have this chunk of da 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 da. That's what you'd have in Hebrew with the accent or the stress onto the words. Here we have a chiasmic pattern within a smaller unit, even more so than what we've seen in the stanza and the strophe. Here it just deals with a set of 4 words. And again, we got to change the word order around from what we would read it in the English, because Hebrew is written in a little different fashion than what we do in English. We change around the word order to fit our type of reading so it flows well. But if we look at it in the original Hebrew, you have the chiasmic pattern with water on the 2 outsides. Water is spoken of first, and then it's referred to as stream towards the end. And then you have the idea of justice and righteousness in the middle being synonymous with each other as well. So you have this little mini chiasmic pattern within this bicolon itself. So we haven't looked at all the poetic devices that there ever could be in Hebrew poetry, but that gives us a basic idea of what's out there and some different ways on how to interpret those and what to watch for. But now I want to put it all together, and what do we do with this information? How does this aid the biblical student in interpretation? Now we looked at each individual part and how we're to interpret those, but how does it help us in the grand scheme of things of interpreting an entire poem, or what that, I should rephrase that, of what a specific phrase means within the poem as a whole. So I want to take a text that's kind of hard and kind of confusing to most people. Let's look at Amos chapter 5 verse 13 and say we're trying to determine what this passage means when it says, "Therefore the prudent keep silent at that time, for it is an evil time." What we can do is we can take these poetic devices that we've looked at that correspond to verse 13 to help us to interpret it. So let's use the chiasmic pattern that we found in the strophe. All right, so we see at the very bottom of my slide, verse 13 is represented by the alphabetical letter A. So that means it's paralleled to the A that's at the top of our slide that was verse 10 in the chiasmic pattern. So they hate the one who rebukes in the gate and they abhor the one who speaks uprightly is the phrase that's parallel to verse 13. Remember, the chiasmic pattern is the same as like a synonymous parallelism, but it breaks it up more. Instead of having the parallel passages right next to each other, to kind of break it up a little bit, it puts it in a chiasmic pattern, so there's still parallelism, but they're not always right next to each other, which can get kind of overwhelming to a listener. So this is a synonymous, basically, way of saying what verse 13 is up there in 10. Now that we've seen that in the strophe, let's look at the stanza. All right, so verse 13 falls in the chiasmic stanza pattern of the letter C, which is verses 10 through 13, and those are synonymously parallel with verse 7. Verse 7 says, "You turn justice to wormwood and lay righteousness to rest in the earth." Let's now put it all together. So the verse that we're looking at is, "Therefore the prudent keep silent at that time, for it is an evil time." Synonymously parallel to that passage in the strophe, through the chiasmic pattern, is a verse that says, "They hate the one who rebukes in the gate, and they abhor the one who speaks uprightly." The synonymous parallel passage to that in the chiasmic pattern in the stanza gives us the passage, "You who turn justice to wormwood and lay righteousness to rest in the earth." So these parallel passages are showing us that the people of Israel hated the people who rebuked them at the gate, and they hated the people who spoke uprightly. And they wanted to turn justice into something nasty and to kill righteousness. So since those passages are synonymously parallel to the prudent keeping silent, we can agree then with what Smith and Page have to say when they claim that the prudent are silent not from a lack of speaking out, but the silence is in reference to the people of Israel no longer seeking the prudent out for counsel. And we get that interpretation based off of what we see with the synonymous parallel passages through the stanzas and the strophe, through the chiasmic patterns. Now, this is not the only thing we do to interpret verse 13, because we haven't looked at the context of the strophe as a whole that it was set up in, and we talked about not taking stanzas out of context, because they're complete units of thought, so we need to look at the complete stanza that verse 13 falls into as well, let alone, not to mention what we've already looked at in the hermeneutical principles, as looking at this verse 13 in the context of Amos's book as a whole, and prophecy as a whole, and then in the big scheme of things in the Bible as a whole. So this isn't the only research that you would obviously do in a poetic book, but I hope you can see here how learning the structure of the Hebrew poetry and the devices that are used helped us to find passages that better enable us to interpret the passage we're looking at. Now, we happen to not look at the SORITES and the TERRACE and stuff because none of those happen to correlate with verse 13 in a direct relationship. But if we would have chosen another passage, we might have had to look more in depth into those and how those patterns worked to interpret a passage. So I hope this gives you at least a basic idea of how to study a book when it's written in poetry and how to better find these poetic devices and then have those help you determine the meaning of passages and to not overanalyze a biblical text by going too far because you miss the concept of the poetry behind it.